The topic we will study is about the second trumpet. Revelation chapter 8 verse 8 and 9. And the second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. And a third of the creatures which were in the sea, which had life, died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Take note. The phrase, a great mountain burning with fire. Mountain in the Old Testament often represents a kingdom or empire. Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 24 and 25. I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea before your very eyes for all the evil that they have done in Zion, declares the Lord. Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain. Declares the Lord, which destroys the whole earth. I will stretch out my hand against you, and roll you down from the crags, and make you a burnt mountain. In the prophetic vision of Daniel, God's kingdom is described in terms of a great mountain, Daniel 2 verse 35. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all together were broken in pieces, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. We have now the idea that in the judgment passages of the Old Testament, mountains as representing nations are always the object of God's judgments. The next phrase we will study was cast into the sea. Jeremiah 51 verse 42. The sea has come up on Babylon, she is covered with its tumultuous waves. Verse 63 and 64. When you finish reading this book, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. And say, thus shall Babylon sink, to rise no more, because of the disaster that I am bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted. The destruction of ancient Babylon is described in the prophecy of Jeremiah as it sinks into the sea. Babylon shall sink down and not rise again. John the Revelator used the same language in describing spiritual Babylon. Revelation 18 verse 21. And a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, thus will Babylon the great city be thrown down violence, and will not be found any longer. As the second angel sounds his trumpet, something like a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. Mountain symbolizes a kingdom. The great mountain of Revelation 8 verse 8 has to do with a great kingdom. The scene of the second trumpet is built entirely on the description of the fall of ancient Babylon in the prophecy of Jeremiah. The prophet predicted that God would judge Babylon, a destroying mountain, who destroys the whole earth. Babylon is to be judged by God. It becomes a burning mountain, which is thrown into the sea and becomes covered by it. The falling of the great mountain in Revelation 8 verse 8 reminds us of the fall of Babylon the Great, described later in Revelation. The texts in Jeremiah about the fall of Babylon provide the clue for understanding the scene of the second trumpet plague. At the time of the writing of the book of Revelation, Babylon was used with reference to the great Roman Empire. Because it destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, it was to suffer its own fate. Both Peter and John used Babylon as the cryptic name for Rome. It appears, therefore, that Christians who saw in Rome the new Babylon could easily identify the symbolic burning mountain of the second trumpet as the prophecy of the downfall of the Roman Empire as the enemy of God's people. After the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the Jewish state, the next scene of judgment is one on a much broader and vaster scale. The second trumpet calls for some terrible, fiery, destructive force to fall into the troubled seas of the ancient world and to turn their turbid waters into blood. After the fall of Jerusalem came the fall of Rome. Irresistible and destructive as a flaming mountain, the hordes of barbarians fell upon the peoples of Rome, till all the empire was involved in a grand and irretrievable catastrophe. Rome was gone and justice again had its way. The burning mountain sinking into the sea turns the sea into blood, leaving 1/3 of the marine life dead and 1/3 of the ships destroyed. This brings to mind the first Egyptian plague in which the waters were turned into blood and the fish were destroyed. The sea in the Old Testament is often the symbol for people in their opposition to God. Ships in the Bible symbolize a nation's pride. The second trumpet thus describes the downfall of the Roman Empire and the devastation of its economic and social order. In conclusion, the plagues of the first two trumpets affect two powers: the Jewish nation and the Roman Empire. These two hostile nations united together in their opposition to God and participated in the crucifixion of Christ. Thus they are the first to experience God's judgments. The judgment began with God's household, those under the covenant who later worked in opposition to Jesus. It spread to those who joined the Jews in putting Jesus to death, and subsequently oppressed and persecuted the church in the first century of the Christian era.